Donald Trump's face turned crimson as Jasmine Crockett's words cut through the live broadcast, not about policy, but about Melania and Barron. The room froze. Viewers leaned in. Was this a calculated strike or an unplanned truth bomb? And how far would Trump go to silence her after that moment? Before we get to this explosive moment, tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe truth still matters, hit subscribe. We've got another jaw-dropping story coming tomorrow. The lights in the Tempe auditorium were bright enough to make every bead of sweat on the panelists' foreheads visible. But the real heat came from the undercurrent in the air. Rows of folding chairs stretched back into shadows, every seat filled. News crews lined the aisles, their cameras panning across the stage where a semicircle of lawmakers sat under a banner reading, "Immigration and Privilege in Modern America." You could feel the tension coil with each question that came from the audience. Then, a local journalist in a crisp blue blazer stepped forward to the microphone, his voice cutting through the hum. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, "is there a double standard in how immigrants are treated in this country?" The phrasing was measured, but the question was a live wire. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Her hands rested lightly on the table, her gaze steady as if she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. "If the First Lady and her son arrived today with no fame, no fortune, no connections," she said, her voice calm and precise, "they'd be treated like any undocumented family, detained or deported. That's the hypocrisy we don't address." The words landed like a hammer strike. Somewhere in the third row, a woman audibly gasped. The moderator blinked twice, as if processing whether to step in. A Republican senator to Jasmine's right shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. A few panelists tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, but the current had already changed direction. Backstage, producers whispered urgently into headsets. Camera operators adjusted their angles, sensing they had the soundbite of the night. On the West Coast feed, the clip rolled without delay. Within minutes, TikTok users were stitching immigrant family stories over Jasmine's quote. The hashtag spread fast. "Same rules for all," Crockett said it, no exception. Jasmine didn't move. She sat in stillness, her posture unshaken, her eyes fixed forward as if daring anyone to challenge the truth she had just spoken. The moment stretched, unbroken, charged with a mix of disbelief and vindication. Then, a hard cut. Black screen. White text. Was it an attack, or a truth too many were afraid to say? The question lingered in silence, daring the audience to pick a side before the story truly began. Jasmine Crockett's political story began far from the spotlight. Before she was a congresswoman commanding headlines, she was a civil rights attorney in Texas, taking cases others avoided. She specialized in defending people who had no leverage. Her work wasn't glamorous, but it was surgical. Every argument she made came with proof attached. Documents, timestamps, sworn statements. She practiced what her team called receipt-first politics. Never enter a fight without the evidence to win it. Her style was deliberate. She spoke in a measured tone, her sentences compact and sharp, like she was building a legal case in real time. She knew that for black women in public life, every word was judged, every tone dissected. That awareness didn't make her timid, it made her precise. She understood the trap of tone policing, that unspoken demand to soften the truth so the powerful could hear it without discomfort, and she refused to play along. Immigration wasn't just policy for Jasmine, it was lived experience through her constituents. She had walked into kitchens still warm from morning coffee and found them silent, because ICE had taken the family hours earlier. She had sat with children translating their parents' fear into English for courtrooms that barely looked at them. She had watched the human cost of order being enforced by rules written for those already safe from their consequences. Rena Barrow, her assistant, knew the rhythm by heart. Rena was the steady voice in Jasmine's ear, the one who measured risks, anticipated attacks, and made sure every file was airtight before Jasmine stepped to a microphone. They both believed in one guiding principle: silence is never surrender. It's a tool. You hold it until the moment. That's why the Tempe moment wasn't a slip. When Jasmine linked Melania and Barron Trump to the reality of undocumented families, it was calculated. She understood it would detonate politically. that it would be cast as personal when it was systemic. She didn't care. Her job wasn't to keep the room comfortable. It was to tell the truth, even when the truth scorched. She had already made peace with the blowback before she ever sat down on that stage. Tonight's quote wasn't a gamble. It was a line she'd been carrying for months, waiting for the exact moment it would land and be impossible to ignore. In this moment, Jasmine wasn't just sparring with an abstract idea. She was cutting into the heart of Donald Trump's self-impeachment. As president in this storyline, Trump had long treated his family as untouchable symbols. Melania and Barron weren't merely relatives, they were shields. Any critique involving them, no matter how policy-focused, was branded a personal attack. Inside the West Wing, the reflex was immediate. Press Secretary Colby Dent was already rehearsing the outrage script before Jasmine's sentence had even ended. Dent's instinct was to choke off the story before it grew legs, flood friendly media, frame Crockett's words as disrespect, and pivot to patriotism. In the same room, Vice President Raymond Holt sat rigid, eyes forward. Holt wasn't prone to theatrics, but he understood how bad this looked for them. If the public saw Jasmine's analogy as truth instead of insult, it would be a rare moment where Trump's narrative cracked. On Capitol Hill, the knives were coming out. Representative Earl Maddox was crafting a censure resolution before the broadcast ended, convinced that punishing Jasmine would serve as a warning to others. Representative Shelton Briggs saw an opening to pile on, feeding lines to conservative radio about crossing sacred lines. Speaker Thad Norwood, ever the tactician, was more concerned with maintaining order and optics than the substance of the debate. Beyond the Beltway, the media ecosystem revved up. Conservative radio host Dale Ridgely called the remark a spit in the face of American tradition. Partisan podcasters clipped the line, stripped it of context, and ran it under graphics screaming, "Outrage!" But not every outlet fell in line. Some establishment commentators hesitated, watching early polling before committing to either side. Meanwhile, the country beyond Washington had its own conversation. Students debated it in dorm lounges. Immigrant families shared the clip in group chats. Teachers discussed it in civics class, and clergy wrestled with the moral weight of the comparison. For many who had lived the double standard Jasmine was describing, the remark wasn't offensive. It was a mirror held up to the nation. That was the fracture point. This wouldn't be decided by the politicians trading press releases or the pundits filling airtime. The real verdict would come from millions of Americans deciding in their own living rooms whether Jasmine Crockett had committed a political sin or spoken an undodgeable truth the country had been dodging for far too long. The air inside the Tempe Civic Center was thick with the polite tension that comes before a political debate turns unpredictable. The panel, the three Republicans, 2 Democrats and 1 independent, sat in a neat arc under the glare of television lights. Behind them, a massive American flag hung like a backdrop for consensus politics. The audience, a mix of local voters, students, and activists, had settled into a rhythm: question, answer, polite applause. It was civic theater, choreographed and contained. That calm ended when a local journalist stood, microphone trembling slightly. "Congresswoman Crockett," he asked, "is there a double standard in how immigrants are treated in this country?" The room's energy shifted. It was the kind of question that invited platitudes. Jasmine Crockett, however, didn't do platitudes. She leaned toward her mic, her voice low but deliberate. "If the First Lady and her son arrived today with no fame, no fortune, and no connections," she said, "they'd be treated like any undocumented family, detained or deported. That's the hypocrisy we don't address." For a heartbeat, the hall went silent. Then came a ripple, an audible gasp from the third row, a sharp intake of breath from the moderator. A Republican senator 2 seats over straightened abruptly, his jaw tightening. Even through the blinding stage lights, Jasmine could see the audience scanning each other's faces, gauging who would flinch first. The moderator tried to interject, offering a pivot to another topic, but the moment had already expanded beyond his reach. The camera operators knew it, zooming tighter on Jasmine's composed expression. Her hands were folded neatly on the table. Her gaze stayed forward. She didn't backtrack, didn't soften the language. A murmur rolled through the audience. Someone in the back whispered, "She said, Melania and Barron? The words traveled like a spark over dry brush. This wasn't just immigration policy. It was a direct challenge to the unwritten rule that presidential families were untouchable in public discourse. Backstage, a producer from the Arizona Public Affairs Network was already marking the clip. "We'll need this for social in the next half hour," she said into her headset. She could see the hashtags forming in real time. Rhymes said it. The West Coast feed would carry it in minutes. In that instant, the panel wasn't a panel anymore. It was a fracture line. Some faces showed open discomfort, others barely concealed admiration. The audience had stopped treating the night as a civic exercise. Now, it was a reckoning. The clip's life began right there, in the moment before the moderator's forced smile and the clumsy segue. For those in the room, it felt like the floor had shifted. For millions watching later, it would feel like a line in American politics had just been crossed. By the time the panel wrapped and the Tempe audience filed out into the cool desert night, the clip was already in motion. Producers had trimmed it to a clean 12 seconds, just Jasmine's quote, the audible gasp, and her stillness afterward. On Twitter, the first uploads carried captions like, "She said what no one else would," and "The truth hurts." Back in Washington, the night was winding down for most of the political class, but not for the West Wing. In the private dining room, Donald Trump was halfway through a plate of meatloaf when Press Secretary Colby Dent rushed in, tablet in hand. He played the clip without preamble. Trump's fork froze mid-air. "She dragged my wife and son into this." His voice climbed quickly, sharp and clipped. "We make this about attacking a child. Hit every network. Now." Dent didn't argue. His mind was already moving through the checklist. Call Fox, alert the morning shows, draft a statement framing Crockett's words as a personal smear. The playbook was clear. Pivot from policy to outrage, from systems to family. Across the country in a quiet Tempe diner, Jasmine and her aide Rena Barrow sat at a corner booth. The waitress topped off their coffee without interrupting the silence. Rena finally spoke. "It's going to be bad, Jazz. Threats, headlines, maybe worse." Jasmine stirred her coffee slowly. Storm or not, it needed saying. Her tone carried no bravado, only certainty. She had measured the line before she said it. She knew what it would cost. By 10 p.m. local time, TikTok had claimed the clip. Creators stitched Jasmine's words over footage of family separations at border facilities. Others overlaid text from news reports on asylum denials. A recurring caption appeared, "Same rules or no rules." The soundbite traveled without context, its precision making it stronger. Hashtags surged. "Same rules for all. No privilege passed. Crockett said it." By midnight Eastern, the 12-second clip had crossed 3 million views. Conservative influencers clipped it further, muting the gasp and looping the words "First Lady and her son" for emphasis. Their captions called it disgraceful and beyond the pale. In newsrooms, editors debated whether to lead with the policy point or the controversy. For some, the calculation was purely audience-driven. Outrage meant engagement. For others, it was the uncomfortable recognition that the double standard she named was real. By the time Jasmine and Rena walked back to their hotel, the phone alerts had become constant. Calls from colleagues, messages from friends, notifications of new articles. She silenced the device, aware that the real fight would begin at sunrise. In Washington, Dent's media grid was already live. By dawn, there would be no avoiding it. Morning in Washington broke with a media frenzy. At 7:02 a.m., Donald Trump walked to the White House podium flanked by flags, his jaw set. Cameras snapped as he launched. "What Congresswoman Crockett said last night was a disgrace. It was dangerous. She attacked my wife, the First Lady, and my son, a minor child, in front of a national audience." He jabbed the lectern with his index finger. "This is what's wrong with our politics. People willing to drag innocent families into their hateful rhetoric." Vice President Raymond Holt stood to the side, hands clasped, eyes forward. His expression didn't change, but the stiffness in his posture betrayed discomfort. Colby Dent shuffled papers at the edge of the frame, blinking hard as if already anticipating the next round of questions he'd have to spin. The talking points had been written overnight. Shift focus to family attacks. Avoid discussing the underlying hypocrisy she'd named. By mid-morning, the conservative airwaves had synchronized. Dale Ridgely, the dominant voice on drive-time radio, called her unhinged and obsessed with tearing down American families. His tone dripped with contempt as he played the clip 3 times, each replay cutting off the sentence before the words detained or deported. On cable news, the same framing took hold, panels arguing over civility rather than policy. On Capitol Hill, Rep. Shelton Brigg stepped in front of the cameras, shaking his head as though deeply pained. "We cannot let this kind of language go unanswered," he declared. "I will join Rep. L. Maddox in pursuing a formal censure to defend the dignity of the first family." Maddox, never missing a chance to escalate, promised to defend decency in the House of Representatives and urged leadership to schedule a vote. Jasmine's first response came not on Twitter but live on CNN. Sitting across from Anderson Cooper, she looked composed, hands folded. Cooper asked if she regretted the comment. "Not personal," she replied evenly. "Political and factual. We apply one set of rules for the powerful, another for everyone else. If pointing that out is an attack, then the truth is an attack." Cooper pressed her on the potential costs. Jasmine didn't blink. "Silence costs more," she said. The words landed quietly, but they carried the same precision as the line in Tempe. She wasn't playing for applause. She was drawing a line. By lunchtime, the clip from CNN was climbing alongside the original. 2 narratives now competed for dominance. One about a reckless insult, the other about a systemic truth. Both sides knew the next moves would decide which story the country remembered. The first volley came from Twitter, just past midnight. A sarcastic post from a satirical account read, "I should check the First Lady's paperwork just to be sure." It was clearly meant as a joke, but within hours, Deport Melania began trending. At first, it carried the air of online mockery, a quick-hit meme cycle that would fade by morning. But something unexpected happened. Immigrant rights activists seized the tag, not to push deportation, but to expose the double standards baked into the system. Within a day, the hashtag transformed into a sprawling thread of lived experiences. Users posted side-by-side comparisons, grainy footage of ICE raids in meatpacking towns next to glossy modeling portfolio shots from the First Lady's early career. Others paired Jasmine's Tempe line with immigration case files, showing legal immigrants who scrutinized for years while celebrity spouses sailed for. The contrast was visceral, and the clips racked up millions of views. News networks looped the Tempe exchange on a near-constant cycle. On the right, the framing was decorum versus decency, hammering Jasmine for what they called a needless personal attack. On the center-left, the framing shifted toward decorum versus proof, acknowledging the discomfort but also interrogating the underlying claim. The repetition gave the moment oxygen. Each replay made the words harder to ignore. Late-night television tried to split the difference. Comedians teased the First Lady's visa luck with well-crafted punchlines, but the laughter often stalled when clips of ICE agents separating families rolled immediately after. The audience chuckled, then shifted in their seats. The humor landed, but the silence after did too, an unfunctional reminder of what Jasmine's words had laid bare. Meanwhile, influencers and independent creators pounced on the moment for deeper dives. TikTok explainers broke down the alphabet soup of visa categories, pointing out how chain migration actually worked and who typically benefited from it. Podcasts specializing in political history traced the legacy of privilege pipelines in U.S. immigration, using Jasmine's Tempe clip as their opening audio cue. Educational Instagram carousels laid out timelines, the First Lady's immigration process in one column, anonymized case histories of undocumented mothers in another. Engagement skyrocketed not because the content was scandalous, but because it was accessible. People who had never cared about visa law now had a shareable primer, anchored in a single quote from a panel in Tempe, Arizona. Cable segments began bringing in immigration attorneys to discuss the reality behind the rhetoric. One attorney noted, "The law isn't applied equally. Fame, fortune, and the right political connections can move mountains. That's not an opinion, it's a fact. That soundbite, clipped and subtitled, traveled almost as fast as Jasmine's original remark. By the third day, the digital ecosystem was split between outrage and curiosity. Hashtag wars raged. Same rules for all versus shame on Crockett, each side producing its own media ecosystem. Supporters pointed to the flood of documented cases now surfacing online. Detractors clung to the framing of attacking a child and warned of dangerous precedents. Even foreign press picked it up. European papers framed it as an American hypocrisy story. Latin American outlets tied it to broader conversations about migration and privilege. The Tempe panel had become a prism. Everyone could see their own reflection in it, for better or worse. And through it all, Jasmine stayed silent on social media. No clarifying tweets, no follow-up posts. Her restraint made the moment bigger. Without her feeding the cycle, the coverage had to rely on the clip itself, forcing the country to re-watch, re-listen, and reconsider exactly what she had said, and what it revealed. By the end of the week, the Tempe moment was no longer just a political clip. It had become a cultural fault line. Cafeterias in Phoenix buzzed with heated lunchtime arguments. In one corner, a group of construction workers debated whether Jasmine had crossed the line by mentioning the First Lady's immigration story. "It's low to bring a man's wife into it," one said, stabbing at his sandwich. Another shook his head. She didn't insult her. She made a point about fairness. You can't talk about policy without talking about who benefits. The same conversations were unfolding in barbershops, law school lounges, and church parking lots. In Houston, a retired veteran told his fishing buddy that it was about damn time someone said it. In Miami, a young conservative mother insisted it was uncalled for, only for her college-age daughter to counter, "So it's okay to talk about other people's families, just not theirs." Safety divide did not just symbolize again, but not neatly partisan, not versus substance. Politeness versus honesty. Dinner tables became battlegrounds. In Des Moines, a family with 3 generations present found themselves raising their voices over mashed potatoes. The grandparents, lifelong Republicans, saw Jasmine's words as disrespectful. Their son, an independent, admitted it was harsh, but argued that the system's bias was real. The granddaughter, a high school senior, pulled out her phone to show them TikTok clips pairing the Tempe moment with images from border detention centers. "This is why she said it," she said, her voice breaking. Flash polls reflected the same split. Among independents, a slim majority tilted toward calling the remark effective if uncomfortable. Within the GOP base, disapproval hardened into near unanimity. Moderates, however, were murkier, hesitant to embrace the rhetoric but unwilling to dismiss the point. For campaigns on both sides, the numbers were gold. Fundraising emails hit inboxes before the ink on the polling memos dried. Through it all, Jasmine's inbox overflowed. Rena triaged hundreds of messages a day, flagging the credible threats for security and filtering through the rest. Some were venomous, dripping with misogyny and racism. Others brimmed with gratitude. A handwritten letter from an elderly farm worker in Yuma thanked her for saying the thing we're never allowed to say. A young mother in El Paso sent a photo of her 2 children, with a note, "You gave me hope that someone sees us." From Salinas came a postcard covered in stickers. "We're not invisible anymore." In Los Angeles, a group of college students projected Jasmine's Tempe quote onto the side of a downtown building. In Wichita, an after-school civics club turned the clip into a debate topic for their end-of-year competition. The moment wasn't just a flash of outrage. It was being woven into grassroots conversations, civic lessons, and community organizing. But the backlash was equally organized. Conservative radio hosts hammered the phrase, "attacked a child," into every segment, repeating it with military precision. Callers pledged to campaign against her, even outside their districts. Online, coordinated accounts worked to flood comment sections with the same talking points, trying to drown out the sympathetic voices. By the 10th day, it was clear that this wasn't fading. The Tempe moment had split the country into camps that weren't going to reconcile anytime soon. For Jasmine, it was both a badge of honor and a warning. The support meant her words had struck the chord she intended. The hate meant she had also touched the live wire of America's deepest hypocrisies. On Capitol Hill, the censure drumbeat began in earnest. Earl Maddox, a Republican firebrand from Alabama, filed the motion just after sunrise, stepping into the press gallery with a smirk and a stack of papers. "This is about defending decency," he declared, flanked by colleagues who nodded solemnly for the cameras. By noon, 47 signers had attached their names, their statements laced with outrage and warnings about dangerous precedent. Cable producers cleared their schedules for the inevitable floor showdown, knowing that confrontation sells. The White House, meanwhile, was locked in its own cycle of damage control. Senior aides gathered in the Roosevelt Room, the mood brittle. Staffers warned that continuing to hammer the attack on a child narrative risked keeping the story alive. "Stay on script," one comms official urged, careful to avoid phrases that could open the door to liability. But inside that carefully chosen language was the truth. They were as worried about Melania's reaction as they were about public perception. Leaks began almost immediately. Politico ran a piece quoting an unnamed staffer saying the First Lady had privately requested no more public mentions of her or Barron in political exchanges. That alone might have softened the news cycle. But then came the memo that shifted the entire conversation. Abigail Royce, a mid-level communications staffer frustrated with the double standard, sent a copy of an internal briefing to a trusted reporter. The memo detailed concerns over increased scrutiny of Melania's own immigration history, specifically how her early work in the United States predated her visa category. It didn't accuse her of wrongdoing, but the phrasing was careful enough to make clear. Questions could arise that no one wanted to answer under oath. Within hours, 2 independent sources confirmed its authenticity. Headlines pivoted overnight. The Washington Post ran with, "First Lady wants out. President doubles down." CNN's chyron the next morning was blunt. In-medication's spotlight turned on Melania. Even outlets that had previously blasted Jasmine now found themselves in a more nuanced position. The story wasn't just about a congresswoman's remark anymore. It was about what that remark had. Outside the Beltway, the institutional ripples extended into the streets. In Albuquerque, a rally formed on short notice, signs reading, "We're not invisible" and "Same rules for all." Miami saw a gathering outside a federal courthouse where speakers tied Jasmine's Tempe moment to broader calls for immigration reform. In Wichita, a coalition of faith leaders issued a joint letter urging leaders to address the inconsistencies between our laws and our values. Bakersfield activists projected the hashtag "Same rules for all" onto the site of a city hall building, the glow visible for blocks. Within Democratic circles, strategists saw opportunity. Some urged Jasmine to lean into the moment, using it as a springboard for policy advocacy. Others worried that staying too close to the fire might limit her coalition building. Jasmine herself stayed measured, repeating that her statement was about the principle, not the person. That discipline kept her from giving opponents fresh ammunition, even as they tried to bait her with new attacks. By the end of the second week, the fight had shifted from one viral moment to a sustained national conversation. Committees began quietly asking for briefings on visa processes. Cable producers pitched extended segments on how immigration really works for the rich versus everyone else. What had started as a split-second remark on stage had cracked open a debate that institutions, political, media, and civic. The censure drumbeat in Washington echoed far beyond the marble halls, seeping into coffee shops, bus stops, and community centers across the country. In Los Angeles, a muralist began painting Jasmine's face beside the words, "Same rules for all" in bright crimson and cobalt, the kind of public art that demands to be photographed. In a Queens laundromat, 2 women folded sheets and argued over whether Jasmine's comment was an act of bravery or a reckless breach of decorum. One pointed at the muted TV showing a cable news panel saying, "She didn't lie. They just don't like how it sounds." The other shook her head, concerned about inviting more division. Across college campuses, student groups seized the moment. Political science clubs hosted late-night forums dissecting not just Jasmine's words, but the layered history of immigration law and privilege. Black student unions invited immigrant rights advocates to unpack the double standard. How accusations of impropriety are leveled when certain people come through the system, while others are applauded for making it. In these rooms, Jasmine's remark wasn't a scandal. It was a case study in strategic disruption. The entertainment world began its own flirtation with the moment. Late-night hosts crafted monologues, threading humor through the tension. using the Tempe clip as a freeze frame for punchlines, then pivoting to real talk about hypocrisy. Satirical news shows played split screens, Melania's runway photos alongside DHS raid footage, forcing viewers to reconcile two realities in one glance. On streaming platforms, political debate podcasts spiked in downloads when they released episodes titled, "Same Rules, Same Country." Music artists joined in subtle ways. A viral TikTok track laid Jasmine's voice over a beat, her words syncopated like a hook, and within days it had been used in 200,000 videos, from dance routines to hard-hitting montages about immigrant detention. Spoken word poets performed in open mics, weaving her sentence into verses about displacement, borders, and what it means to belong. Even the corporate world couldn't ignore it. Marketing departments debated whether to engage or steer clear. A sneaker brand quietly released an ad showing diverse athletes breaking through literal white picket fences, ending on the tagline, "Barriers are meant to be broken." Viewers debated whether it was solidarity or opportunism, but either way it kept the conversation burning. Through all this, Jasmine herself remained measured. She didn't flood the airwaves. She didn't feed the outrage machine. Instead, she gave one carefully chosen interview to a national morning show, where she spoke not of scandal but of standards, how no one's family should be dragged but how no law should bend around the powerful. It was a tone that let the culture do the talking for her. On Capitol Hill, the political class moved with a precision that only emerges when outrage and opportunity align. Earl Maddox's censure motion gained momentum like a snowball rolling downhill, attracting not just hardline conservatives but a handful of Democrats from swing districts wary of the optics. The motion wasn't just about punishing Jasmine, it was a chance for lawmakers to signal allegiance to their respective bases. Cable news ran graphics of the censure count, like an election night tally, each new co-signer treated as breaking news. Inside the West Wing, the fallout became a matter of daily crisis management. Communications Director Paul Dent convened war room-style meetings, complete with color-coded threat assessments. Leaks described a president obsessed with framing the incident as an attack on my family, even as polling showed independents splitting on whether Jasmine's words were fair commentary. The First Lady's office, meanwhile, issued no official statement, a silence that only deepened speculation. Staffers whispered about her frustration with being drawn into the fight, fueling headlines that pitted her restraint against the president's combativeness. Industry lobbyists and political consultants also moved quickly. Immigration reform groups saw the moment as a rare cultural flashpoint, pouring money into digital ads that reframed Jasmine's remark as a call for equal treatment under the law. Conversely, conservative advocacy organizations launched targeted campaigns in vulnerable House districts, warning that her logic opens the door to smearing private citizens. The clash became a proving ground for 2026 midterm messaging, with both sides testing lines that would later appear in fundraising emails and stump speeches. In the political media ecosystem, the story created its own gravitational pull. Talk radio and partisan podcasts turned it into a week-long content engine, dissecting every syllable of her Tempe quote. Editorial boards took sides, with some praising her courage to state the obvious and others condemning her for crossing what they called the last line of decency. Even traditionally apolitical outlets weighed in, framing it as a debate over whether public figures' families are ever fair game in political discourse. The corporate sphere wasn't insulated either. News networks saw ratings bumps from the controversy, prompting executives to assign dedicated teams to track the Crockett cycle for as long as it stayed hot. PR firms advised their clients on how to navigate conversations that might touch the subject, especially in industries reliant on immigrant labor or with public-facing immigrant executives. Some CEOs issued carefully worded statements about fairness and the American dream, while others chose silence, fearing consumer backlash from either direction. By the end of the week, it was clear this wasn't just a flare-up. Jasmine's words had forced a reckoning across political, media, and corporate arenas. The question wasn't whether the fallout would last, it was who would harness it, and who would be burned by it. The porch light on her childhood block in Tyler, Texas, glowed soft against the dusk. Jasmine Crockett sat alone, in a folding chair, her phone propped on a ledge. No aides, no lighting crew, no broadcast Cairo, just her voice carried into the night. The stillness gave the moment weight, as though the silence itself was daring her to fill it with something lasting. She began, not with outrage, but with reflection. "For too long, silence has been both a shield and a shroud," she said. "A shield for the powerful, who know their mistakes and their exceptions will rarely be spoken aloud. And a shroud for the powerless, who are told their stories don't belong in the daylight. That silence is what I broke in Tempe." Her tone was steady, deliberate, not a defense but an explanation rooted in clarity. She drew a clean line between what was personal and what was systemic. That night, I wasn't speaking about individuals. I was exposing a comparison, one that every immigrant family in this country knows in their bones. The rules bend for some, they crush others. Melania Trump's journey is not the point. The point is the chasm her story reveals when compared to the raids, the detentions, the families torn apart without mercy. Her words hung in the air, firm and undeniable. The cost of speaking out had been heavy, and she named it. They can vote to censure me. They can write op-eds and flood the airwaves. But what they cannot do is vote away reality. No gavel, no resolution, no talking point can erase the truth that millions of people live every day. Then her voice shifted, carrying an intimacy that reached through the screen to those who needed to hear her most. "To the families who carry papers like armor every time you leave your home, I see you. I hear your fear, your exhaustion, your resilience. You are not invisible." She paused, letting the acknowledgement breathe. She turned next to the broader public. "To those who are only watching from the sidelines, I say this. Tell your story. The system counts on your quiet. It counts on your hesitancy, your doubt, your silence. Break it, because every story told is another crack in the wall of indifference." And finally, to her colleagues in Congress, her appeal sharpened. "To lawmakers, I ask you to pass standards that end the privilege pipeline once and for all. No one's proximity to power should purchase exceptions to the law. If we truly mean equality, then equality must mean everyone." She closed with a single sentence, clear and immovable. "Truth doesn't need approval. It just needs a spine." With that, Jasmine reached forward, ended the stream, and rose from her chair. She walked off the porch into the Texas dusk, her figure swallowed by the shadows. The phone screen faded, but her words remained, echoing in classrooms, courtrooms, sanctuaries, and union halls across the country.